You cannot keep hiding the truth for him. He will never care about us. We have to stand up for ourselves.
She had arisen before dawn that particular morning, as she rose every morning to lay the fires in the family wing before the household stirred, moving through corridors still dark enough that she navigated more by sight than by memory, counting the turns the way she had counted them for 4 years, past the long gallery with its rows of Ashworth ancestors staring down in oil and gilt frame, past the closed door of the late Duke's study that no one had properly used since his death 18 months prior, and down the back stair to the kitchens, where cook was already coaxing the great range into life with the particular grim patience of a woman who had done the same thing at the same hour for the better part of 30 years. It was there, over a hurried breakfast of bread and weak tea, that she first heard the whispers about Agnes. The spring of 1816 arrived at Ellesmere Hall, not gently as spring was said to arrive in gentler counties, but grudgingly, as though the Yorkshire wolds themselves resented surrendering the last of winter's grip on the land. The frost lingered longer here than the almanacs promised, silvering the kitchen garden's beds well into April, and the wind that came down off the moors carried with it a damp, unrelenting chill that seeped through the servants' quarters, no matter how carefully the fires were banked each night. The house itself, a long, pale expanse of limestone that had stood for the better part of 2 centuries, seemed to hold its breath through the cold months, the way it always did, waiting for a warmth that came in that part of the country far later than anyone below stairs had patience for. For Josephine Wen, senior housemaid of 4 years standing, the season mattered less for its weather than for what it always seemed to bring with it, the annual reckoning of accounts, the tightening of household budgets that inevitably fell hardest on those with the least power to argue against it, and this year, worse than either, the quiet, creeping suspicion that had settled over the servants' hall since the new steward's ledgers had begun showing discrepancies no one below stairs could quite account for. "Missing again," Mrs. Hargrove had said, not to Josephine directly, but to the room at large, in the particular carrying voice she reserved for pronouncements she wished overheard by exactly the right ears. 8 bottles of the good claret gone from the cellar since Tuesday last, and Agnes Pell the only one with a key besides myself and Mr. Renfrew. Josephine had felt her spine straighten before she'd fully decided to speak. "Agnes hasn't the key to the good cellar, Mrs. Hargrove," Josephine had said, setting down her cup with rather more force than the moment strictly required. "I know Agnes hasn't stolen wine she's never had access to. You know what you're told to know, and nothing further, unless you'd like to join her in seeking new employment." The threat had landed exactly as intended, and Josephine had swallowed the rest of what she wanted to say, because the swallowing of it sat uneasily in her chest for the remainder of the morning, because she had watched, over the preceding year, no fewer than 4 servants dismissed for infractions that never quite added up when examined closely. A footman blamed for missing silver he'd never handled, a scullery maid turned out for a debt in the household accounts that predated her employment entirely, and now, it seemed, Agnes Pell was to be the latest name added to a list that grew longer each season, while Mr. Renfrew's own accounts, so far as anyone below stairs could observe, only seemed to grow tidier. 3 weeks earlier, though Josephine did not know how it connected to any of it, Nathaniel Ashworth, 9th Duke of Ellesmere Hall, had not planned to become a gardener. He had planned only to discover the truth of his own household before it cost him another honest servant's livelihood. The suspicion had begun quietly with a letter from his own solicitor in London, forwarded almost as an afterthought, noting a curious pattern in the quarterly accounts his steward submitted: expenses for repairs never visibly undertaken, wages recorded for staff positions that had, upon closer inquiry, sat vacant for months, and a rate of servant turnover at Ellesmere that seemed, on paper, entirely disproportionate to a household of its modest size. Nathaniel had read the letter twice, then a third time, and had done what he always did when a problem resisted easy explanation from a comfortable distance. He had gone to see the truth of it for himself, rather than trust it to another man's account of events.
He had arrived at Ellesmere 3 weeks prior under the name Sam Carlo, hired as an under-gardener through an employment agency in York that had no reason to connect his plain references to the family that owned the very estate he now sought work upon. He had let his hands blister over honest labor, had eaten in the servants' hall rather than the great house, had listened in the particular unguarded way servants spoke among themselves when they believed no one of consequence was present, and had learned, in 3 weeks, considerably more about the true state of his own household than 18 months of polished quarterly reports had ever troubled to reveal. He had not expected, in the middle of it, to encounter a housemaid sharp-tongued enough to defend a fellow servant against a housekeeper twice her seniority, in a kitchen where every other voice had gone carefully, prudently silent. He had not expected to find himself 3 weeks into a disguise meant purely for observation, waiting rather more eagerly than was strictly professional for his work in the kitchen garden to bring him within earshot of her again. The garden, when Josephine reached it that afternoon with a basket for the season's first early greens, was still more mud than growth, the kitchen beds only beginning to show the pale green shoots that would, by June, fill the household's table with something other than root vegetables and preserved stores. She found the new under-gardener kneeling near the herb border, turning soil with a patience that struck her, not for the first time, as somewhat out of proportion to the wages such labor commanded. "You've a heavier hand with that spade than the work requires," she observed, setting her basket down at the row's edge. He glanced up. "Do I? Most men doing that work for a season's wages learn to spare their backs early. You dig like it matters to you personally whether the time survives the transplanting." Something flickered across his face. Amusement, she thought, though carefully contained. Perhaps it does matter to me. That's a peculiar sentiment for hired labor. Is sentiment forbidden to hired labor, Miss Wren? Josephine Wren. She said it without particular warmth, the way she gave her name to anyone whose position in the household she hadn't yet fully assessed. And no, I don't suppose sentiments forbidden, only unusual in my experience among men paid by the season rather than by the harvest they actually care to see through. Perhaps I simply prefer finishing what I begin. Perhaps. She studied him a moment longer than strictly necessary, noting, though she couldn't have said why the detail struck her, the faint ink stains along the side of his left hand, incongruous against the mud and the plain labourer's coat. "You've an educated hand for a gardener." He looked down at his own fingers as though seeing them freshly. "I kept accounts before this, for a small estate, numbers mostly." "And you left accounting for turning soil?" "The soil doesn't lie to me about what it needs." It was an oddly weighted answer for so plain a question, and she might have pressed it further had her mind not still been turning over the morning's exchange with Mrs. Hargrove, the particular injustice of it sitting in her chest like a stone she couldn't quite swallow past. "You've heard, I imagine, about Agnes Pell." "I heard she's to be dismissed, missing claret, or so I'm told." "She never touched the good cellar in her life. She's under house staff. She's never had cause nor key to be anywhere near it." "You seem very certain." "I am certain, because I've watched this exact pattern play out 4 times in the year I've served under Mr. Renfrew's management. A servant blamed for something that never quite adds up, dismissed without proper character, and the household accounts somehow no clearer for the loss once the dust settles." She said it more openly than she'd intended, the words arriving faster than her usual caution allowed, but something in the plain, unhurried attention he offered made the caution feel for once unnecessary. "You think the Duke negligent," Seed said. "I think the Duke absent, which amounts to the same for anyone below stairs who has to live with the consequences of it. A house doesn't run itself honestly simply because its master's too occupied elsewhere to notice when it doesn't. And if the Duke were to hear you say so—" "He won't. Dukes don't listen to housemaids, Sam Carlo, whatever their gardeners might overhear on a Tuesday afternoon." She picked up her basket, the moment of unusual candor already receding behind her usual composure. "Mind the time doesn't drown. This soil holds water worse than it should." She left him kneeling among the herb beds and did not see, because she did not look back, the particular expression that settled over his face once she'd gone. Not anger, not offense, but something closer to a man recognizing, for the first time in longer than he cared to admit, that he had just been spoken to entirely honestly by someone with no notion at all of who he truly was. If you already sense that Gardner isn't who he claims to be, comment "The Time" below and subscribe, because what Josephine just said to a duke's face is about to matter more than she could possibly imagine. The days that followed carried Josephine back to the garden kitchen with a frequency she told herself was purely practical. The household's early greens required tending, and someone competent needed to oversee what the new undergardener understood of the estate's particular soil, though she suspected if she examined the excuse too closely, it would not survive close inspection. She found him there most afternoons, and their conversations settled into an easy, unlikely rhythm she did not entirely trust, but found herself, despite every instinct toward caution 4 years of service had taught her, increasingly reluctant to abandon. "You've a curious way of asking questions," she told him one afternoon, watching him examine a row of seedlings with more attention than the task strictly required. "You ask after the household accounts, the steward's habits, which servants have come and gone and why. It's rather a lot of curiosity for a man paid to turn soil. I find households interesting, how they're run, what holds them together, and what quietly rots them from within, while everyone above stairs remains convinced all is well. That's a rather grand way of describing gossip about a country steward. Perhaps I simply dislike waste. Wasted labor, wasted honesty, wasted people dismissed for sins they never committed, while the actual thief keeps his position and his reputation both." She studied him for a long moment. "You speak like a man who's lost something to exactly that kind of waste." Something crossed his face, quick, controlled, gone before she could properly name it. "Perhaps I have." She did not press further. She had learned over 4 years of service that people revealed themselves at their own pace or not at all, and that pressing too hard against a guarded silence rarely produced anything but a deeper one. It was during the 2nd week of their acquaintance that Agnes Pell was formally dismissed, turned out of Ellesmere Hall with 2 weeks' unpaid wages and no character reference at all, on Mrs. Hargrove's sworn testimony that the missing claret could be accounted for by nothing else but the girl's dishonesty. Josephine watched her go from the servants' entrance, watched the girl's thin shoulders shake with the particular silent weeping of someone who understands protest will accomplish nothing, and felt something in her own chest harden into a resolve she hadn't quite possessed the week before. "It isn't right," she said to Sam that same afternoon, finding him in the garden with rather less patience for pleasantries than usual. "She's gone. No character, no wages beyond what she was owed, and for a theft she never committed. I've said as much to Mrs. Hargrove directly, and been told, in essence, to mind my own position before I find myself following Agnes down the drive. And will you mind it?" "I don't know." She sat, without quite deciding to, on the low garden wall beside where he knelt. "I've thought of little else these 3 days. Someone ought to know the truth of what's happening in this house, and I don't know who that someone is meant to be, if not one of us who actually sees it happening. The Duke, perhaps." "The Duke," she repeated, with a short, humorless laugh, "has not set foot at Ellesmere Hall in the whole of the 18 months since his father died. I doubt he'd recognize his own steward's handwriting, let alone the particular pattern of dismissals that's been quietly emptying this house of every servant unlucky enough to notice what Mr. Renfrew's really about." Sam was quiet a long moment, turning a clod of dark soil in his ink-stained hand. "What would you tell him if he were to appear tomorrow and ask you directly?" She considered the question with more seriousness than its hypothetical nature strictly warranted. "I'd tell him his steward's been blaming honest servants for theft he's committing himself, and that 4 people I know of personally have lost their livelihoods and their good names for sins they never committed, while his own accounts grow tidier every quarter he stays away. I'd tell him that a house doesn't run itself justly simply because its master's too far off to see the injustice happening under his own roof. You'd say that to a duke's face. I've said as much to its gardener's face already, she said, with a small, wry smile that surprised her by how genuine it felt. Something in Sam's expression, watching her, had gone very still and very careful, and though Josephine did not understand it at the time, she would come to recognize it later as the particular look of a man deciding in that exact moment that he could no longer bear to let the deception continue a day longer than was strictly necessary to gather the proof he needed. The proof, when he finally assembled it, took considerably less time than he'd expected.
Nathaniel spent the following 3 nights after the household had retired, going through the estate office's ledgers with the particular methodical patience that had once made him, before his father's death, a rather better hand at his own accounts than most men of his rank troubled to become. He found what he'd suspected within the first night, a pattern of dismissals, each one accompanied by a conveniently vague notation of missing goods or unaccounted funds, and beside each notation, in Mr. Renfrew's own careful hand, a sum quietly transferred to an account Nathaniel did not recognize, though a discreet inquiry to his solicitor in York, sent the following morning under his own true name for the first time in 3 weeks, confirmed within 2 days that the account in question belonged to Colby Renfrew's own brother-in-law, conveniently positioned to receive funds that never appeared anywhere in Ellesmere's official records at all. Mrs. Hargrove's involvement, once she knew to look for it, revealed itself just as plainly, her testimony against each dismissed servant matching with suspicious precision whatever Renfrew's ledgers claimed to explain, the two of them operating in a quiet, practiced tandem that had clearly served them well for the better part of 3 years, at the cost of every honest servant unlucky enough to become their next convenient scapegoat. He had what he needed to dismiss them both and see them properly answerable for the theft within 4 days of Agnes Pell's unjust dismissal. He had not yet decided how to tell Josephine Wren the truth of exactly who had been kneeling beside her in that garden, listening to every honest word she'd spoken about a duke she believed entirely oblivious to his own household's suffering. If you already sense the reveal is coming, comment "The Ledgers" below and subscribe, because what happens at dinner tomorrow night is going to change everything Josephine thinks she knows. The summons came the following afternoon, delivered by a footman Josephine barely recognized, informing the household staff that His Grace the Duke of Ellesmere had returned to the estate that very morning, and that a formal dinner would be held that evening to receive several guests of consequence from the neighboring county, requiring the full complement of household staff in proper attendance. The kitchen erupted into the particular controlled chaos such news always produced, silver polished with fresh urgency, the good china retrieved from storage,
cook muttering under her breath about the impossibility of a proper menu assembled with less than a day's notice, and Mrs. Hargrove moving through it all with an anxious, brittle authority that Josephine, watching her more closely than she had in months, recognized now as something considerably less than confidence. She did not see Sam Carlo that entire day, and found herself, amid the frantic preparations, oddly troubled by his absence, though she told herself firmly that a gardener's schedule had no particular reason to intersect with a housemaid's on a day devoted entirely to indoor formality. The dining hall, by the time the guests arrived that evening, had been transformed from its usual dim, half-used state into something closer to what Josephine imagined it must have looked like in the old Duke's time. Candles blazing along the length of the great table, the family silver gleaming under their light, the good crystal catching every flicker until the whole room seemed to shimmer with a warmth Ellesmere Hall had not properly possessed in the 18 months since its master's death. Josephine took her position near the sideboard with the rest of the senior staff, a serving dish balanced carefully in both hands, and it was there, in the particular hush that fell over a room awaiting its host's arrival, that the double doors at the far end of the hall opened, and the Duke of Ellesmere finally entered his own dining room for the first time in 18 months. Josephine's breath caught somewhere beneath her ribs, and the serving dish in her hands very nearly slipped entirely from her grasp. It was Sam, not a gardener in mud-stained laborer's clothes, not the quiet, ink-stained man who had knelt beside her among the herb beds, listening to her speak with more honesty than she'd ever intended towards a duke she believed entirely oblivious to his own household's suffering. Miss Wren, his voice carried easily across the suddenly silent room, formal in a way his gardener's voice had never once been, though the warmth beneath it remained entirely unmistakable to anyone who'd spent 3 weeks to recognize it. Miss Wren, I believe you and I have rather more to discuss than the state of the kitchen garden's time. Every eye in the room turned towards her. Josephine set the serving dish down with hands that trembled just slightly, understanding in that single suspended moment precisely how much she had unknowingly gambled these past 3 weeks, and precisely how little she now knew of the man who had just walked into his own dining room, wearing for the first time since she'd met him the truth of exactly who he was. The guests that evening, several families from the neighboring county, invited Josephine would later learn specifically because Nathaniel required witnesses of unimpeachable standing for what he intended to do next. Watched with open curiosity as his host crossed the length of his own dining hall, past the assembled senior staff, and stopped directly before the housemaid who had gone rigid with shock beside the sideboard. "Your Grace," Josephine managed, her voice considerably steadier than she felt, "I did not know." "I am aware," Nathaniel said, and something in his tone, gentle despite its formality, made plain that the words carried no accusation at all. That was rather the point of the disguise, Miss Wren, though I confess I did not anticipate learning quite so much about my own household's true state from the honest testimony of a housemaid who believed she was speaking only to a gardener. Mrs. Hargrove, standing near the kitchen door with a color rapidly draining from her face, attempted a recovery that fooled no one in the room. "Your Grace, I'm certain whatever Wren has said in idle gossip bears little resemblance to—" "I have spent 3 weeks in this household under an assumed name, Mrs. Hargrove," Nathaniel said, turning to face her fully, and the warmth that had colored his voice toward Josephine vanished entirely, replaced by something considerably colder. "I have reviewed Mr. Renfrew's ledgers personally, going back 3 years, and I have found, matched precisely against each dismissal you personally testified to support, a sum quietly transferred to an account belonging to your own brother-in-law. I would ask you to consider very carefully whether you wish to continue insisting this is idle gossip, or whether you would prefer to explain the matter to the magistrate directly." The room had gone entirely silent, save for the low crackle of the fire and the soft, mortified breathing of a housekeeper watching 3 years of careful theft collapse in front of the very guests she had once hoped to impress with her household's impeccable order. "You," Nathaniel continued, his gaze moving to Mr. Renfrew, who had gone the particular gray-white of a man watching his own ruin arrive precisely on schedule, "will find your position terminated as of this evening, along with Mrs. Hargrove's. I have already engaged a solicitor to pursue the full recovery of what has been taken, and I intend to see every servant wrongly dismissed under your management properly compensated and, where they wish it, reinstated to positions here or wherever they now find themselves settled." Renfrew opened his mouth to protest. Nathaniel did not permit him the chance. "I would advise against argument, Mr. Renfrew. I have the ledgers, I have the bank records, I have, as it happens, 3 weeks of first-hand observation gathered while you believed yourself speaking freely in front of nothing more consequential than a hired gardener. Whatever defense you intend to offer, I assure you it will not survive contact with the evidence." The steward said nothing further. There was, in truth, nothing left for him to say. It was Josephine, standing frozen still near the sideboard through the whole of this exchange, who finally found her voice once the room's attention had settled, uncertain and murmuring, into the aftermath of what had just occurred. "You let me speak against you," she said quietly, once Nathaniel had turned back to her, the assembled guests still watching with the particular fascinated attention of people who understood they had just witnessed something considerably more significant than a formal dinner. "You let me speak the truth," Nathaniel said, "because I needed above everything else to know whether a single person in this household would speak it honestly if they believed no consequence could follow from doing so. You did, Miss Wren, more boldly than any other servant here has managed in 18 months, and I confess I have thought of little else since. I called you negligent, to your own face, thinking you a gardener. You called me exactly what I deserved to be called. For the better part of 18 months I spent avoiding the responsibility of this house rather than face it properly. Something in his expression had gone entirely unguarded now. The formal duke and the quiet gardener, finally, visibly, the same man in front of her. Josephine did not know in that moment whether to feel triumphant or entirely undone, and found, examining the strange mixture of both settling in her chest, that she could not entirely separate one from the other. The days that followed Renfrew and Mrs. Hargrove's dismissal brought a transformation to Ellesmere Hall that Josephine, watching it unfold from her still uncertain position among the senior staff, found almost as remarkable as the revelation that had produced it. Nathaniel engaged a new steward within the week, a careful, meticulous man, recommended by his own solicitor, and set about personally reviewing every dismissal from the preceding 3 years, tracking down each wrongly accused servant with a diligence that surprised even those who had begun cautiously to trust his intentions. Agnes Pell was found within a fortnight, taken in by a cousin in a neighboring village, and returned to Ellesmere with a proper character reference, back wages, and a formal apology that left the girl weeping with relief considerably different from the despair Josephine had witnessed at her departure.
"I don't understand," Agnes said on her first evening back in the servants' hall, still visibly unable to credit the reversal of her fortunes. Why would the Duke trouble himself so thoroughly over a housemaid's dismissal? Josephine, setting bread on the table with rather more attention to the task than it strictly required, found she did not have a simple answer to offer. The truth, when Nathaniel finally sought her out properly, 3 weeks after the dinner that had ended his disguise, arrived in the same kitchen garden where the whole of it had begun, the herb beds now grown considerably fuller than the mud and shoot beginnings she remembered from their first exchange. "You've been avoiding the garden," he observed, finding her there with a basket of newly ready thyme. "I've been uncertain how a housemaid is meant to behave toward a duke who once knelt beside her pretending to be a gardener." "The same way she behaved before she knew," he said, "honestly, I would hope. I have found I have very little patience remaining for anything less, since 3 weeks of disguise taught me precisely how rare honesty proves to be in a house where everyone believes flattery serves them better than truth. I called you negligent. You were entirely correct to. I told you, believing you a gardener, that dukes don't listen to housemaids. I have spent every day since proving you wrong on that particular point," Nathaniel said, "though I confess it required rather more effort than I expected, convincing you I meant it." She looked at him for a long moment, this man she had first known kneeling in the dirt with ink-stained fingers, who had listened to her most unguarded honesty without once revealing what it truly cost him to hear it, and who had, in the weeks since, dismantled a scheme of quiet theft and injustice with the same careful, unhurried attention he'd once given to transplanting thyme. "What is it you actually want, Your Grace, now that Renfrew's gone and Agnes is restored and the household runs honestly again? What is left for a duke to seek from a housemaid he has already heard speak more plainly than anyone else in his employ?" "I want," he said, "to ask you something I have been entirely too formal to ask directly in 3 weeks of disguise and 3 weeks since. I do not wish to be a duke who is only ever spoken to honestly by servants who believe him someone else.
I would like, Josephine Wren, to be spoken to honestly by you for the whole of the rest of my life, if you would permit it, as my wife rather than merely my most fearless housemaid." Josephine set her basket down slowly, the weight of the request settling over her with a gravity she had not, despite every strange turn of the preceding weeks, quite expected to arrive at this particular garden bed. "You are asking a housemaid to become a duchess on the strength of an argument about time. I am asking a woman who told the truth when she believed no one of consequence was listening, to keep telling it to me for considerably longer than 3 weeks, because I find I have grown entirely unwilling to imagine a household run by anyone less honest than you." "Yes," Josephine said, before she had fully considered the enormity of the word. "Though I should warn you, Your Grace, I intend to keep a close eye on whichever steward replaces the last. I've grown rather attached to knowing exactly where every shilling in this house actually goes. I would expect nothing less." And the laugh that followed, unguarded and entirely real, carried across the kitchen garden in a way that made even the newly hired undergardener, watching from a discreet distance, smile privately to himself at whatever had clearly just transpired between his master and the housemaid who had, by every account already circulating through the servants' hall, spoken more boldly to a duke than any woman in the county's memory. They were married that autumn in the small parish church nearest Ellesmere, with the whole of the household staff in attendance. A wedding considerably less formal than most dukes managed, on Josephine's own quiet insistence, though no less deeply felt for its simplicity. Agnes Pell stood among the witnesses, restored fully to her position, and considerably more besides, having been promoted, at Josephine's recommendation, to a role overseeing the household's linens with an authority she had never imagined possible in the weeks following her unjust dismissal. The new steward, a careful man named Whitfield, proved as honest as his predecessor had been corrupt, and Ellesmere's accounts, reviewed properly each quarter now by both Duke and Duchess together, grew steadily healthier, without a single servant losing a position to cover another man's theft. Nathaniel kept, tucked in a small drawer of his study desk, the original trowel he had used during his 3 weeks as Sam Carlo, a small private reminder of the season he had spent learning more about his own household from an honest housemaid's unguarded criticism than 18 months of polished quarterly reports had ever managed to reveal. Josephine, for her part, continued tending the kitchen garden's herb beds herself most mornings, sleeves pushed up exactly as she always had, and made a habit in the years that followed of walking the grounds personally rather than trusting reports of their condition to anyone else. A habit the household staff came to recognize with quiet, private amusement as entirely characteristic of a duchess who had first proven her worth not in a ballroom or a drawing room, but on her knees beside a row of thyme, speaking honestly to a man she believed to be nothing more than a gardener. When visitors asked in later years how the Duke of Ellesmere had come to marry his own housemaid, Josephine always told the story the same simple way. She had spoken boldly, believing no one of consequence was listening, and the man who heard her had decided on the strength of that single honest afternoon that he could no longer bear to build his household on anything less